The world we live in is full of strange anomalies and mysteries that we like to believe can be explained by science and basic human logic. We tell ourselves that there is a rational explanation for every single event, that our senses can sometimes deceive us, and that our minds are prone to playing tricks when we are tired or stressed. We rely on these comforting thoughts to keep the darkness at bay. But every now and then, an event occurs that shatters this fragile illusion. An event where the physical evidence left behind makes it impossible to hide behind the excuse of a hallucination. These are the moments that truly terrify us, because they force us to confront the reality of the unexplained. Our first story takes us back to the late autumn of 2022. A young man was living and working in the busy metropolitan area of Oakland, California. Like many young professionals in the Bay Area, his life was fast-paced and demanding. He worked early morning shifts that required him to be alert and focused, leaving him with very little time for himself during the week. Because of his hectic schedule, he cherished his weekends, and he frequently made the long drive north to visit his parents, who lived in the quiet, scenic coastal town of Eureka. Eureka is located deep in Humboldt County, a region famous for its towering redwood forests, rugged coastlines, and cool, damp weather. To travel between Oakland and Eureka, you have to drive along Highway 101. During the day, this drive is absolutely breathtaking. The highway winds through massive groves of ancient trees, hugs the edges of dramatic ocean cliffs, and passes through charming, historic coastal towns. It is a drive that many people take just for the scenery, but once the sun goes down, Highway 101 undergoes a dramatic and unsettling transformation. The beautiful landscape is swallowed by an oppressive, pitch-black darkness. The highway narrows down to a winding two-lane road in many of the rural northern sections, and there are incredibly long stretches with absolutely no streetlights, no signs of civilization, and zero cell phone service. If your car breaks down or if you run into trouble, you are entirely on your own. It is a lonely, ominous stretch of asphalt that can easily unnerve even the most experienced drivers. On a Sunday evening in late 2022, this young man was preparing to head back to Oakland after a wonderful, relaxing weekend with his parents. By the time he finished packing his bags and saying his goodbyes, it was already 8 o'clock in the evening. In hindsight, he knew that starting a 4-hour drive so late on a Sunday night was a poor decision. He was already feeling the physical fatigue of the weekend, and he knew the dark highway would be challenging. His parents had urged him to stay the night, sleep in his warm bed, and simply drive back early Monday morning. But he was stubborn. He had an early shift waiting for him the next day, and he desperately wanted to sleep in his own bed in Oakland. He figured that if he just kept his focus, he could easily knock out the drive. It was a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. The first 2 hours of the drive went smoothly. The weather was cool and clear, and the road was relatively empty. He listened to music, sipped his coffee, and watched the dark trees pass by in the glow of his headlights. But as he began to approach the small coastal town of Trinidad, the environment changed. Trinidad is a beautiful area, but it is notorious for its sudden and dramatic weather shifts. Quite suddenly, a thick, heavy fog began to roll in from the Pacific Ocean. Now, coastal fog is a regular occurrence in Northern California, and the young man was well accustomed to driving through it. But this fog was unlike anything he had ever seen. It did not drift slowly across the road. It seemed to materialize out of nowhere, swallowing the entire highway in a matter of minutes. Within 5 minutes of the first wisps appearing, the visibility dropped from perfectly clear to less than 20 feet. The fog was so dense and white that it acted like a solid wall. When he turned on his high beams, the light simply bounced off the mist and reflected directly back into his eyes, blinding him. He had to quickly turn them off and rely on his low beams, which barely illuminated the asphalt directly in front of his bumper. He was forced to slow down to a cautious 35 miles per hour. The drive became an agonizing test of endurance. When the fog is that thick, it completely destroys your perception of space, speed, and time. You cannot see the trees on the side of the road, you cannot see the curves ahead, and you lose all sense of how far you have traveled. The world shrinks down to a tiny, blurry bubble of light, and the silence of the night becomes incredibly heavy. He knew the smart thing to do would be to pull off the road and wait for the fog to clear. But on that rugged stretch of Highway 101, there are virtually no safe places to stop. The shoulders are narrow and rocky, and parking a car there in zero visibility is an open invitation to be rear-ended by another vehicle. He decided his only real option was to keep moving forward, slowly and carefully. He had been crawling through the white void for about 30 minutes when his headlights suddenly illuminated a shape on the right shoulder of the road, about 50 feet ahead. At first, it looked like a dark, shapeless mass, but as he drew closer, the details began to resolve, and his heart skipped a beat. It was a person. Based on the height and silhouette, it appeared to be a man wearing dark, heavy clothing. But what made the young man's skin crawl was the person's posture. The man was not walking along the shoulder, and he was not waving his arms to flag down a passing car for help. He did not have a phone in his hand, and he did not appear to be distressed. He was simply standing completely still on the narrow gravel shoulder, facing directly toward the road, staring blankly into the empty space where the car was about to pass. The young man felt a sudden, sharp spike of anxiety. He slowed his car down even further, carefully steering toward the center line to ensure he would not clip the man if he suddenly decided to step out into the lane. As his car rolled slowly past, he stared through the passenger window. The man did not move a single muscle. He did not turn his head to watch the car pass, and his expression remained completely blank and vacant. He looked like an ordinary person, with nothing particularly unusual about his face or clothing, but his complete lack of reaction was deeply unnatural. The driver tried to find a logical explanation. He reasoned that perhaps the man's car had broken down nearby, and he was simply waiting for a tow truck. That would explain why he was standing on the side of the highway in the middle of the night. But as the driver looked ahead and behind, he realized there were no other vehicles parked on the shoulder. There was no broken down car, no hazard lights, and no sign of any other human life. The man was standing entirely alone, miles away from the nearest town, in a freezing, blinding fog, facing the empty road. The driver thought about stopping or turning around to offer assistance. But a powerful, primitive gut instinct screamed at him to keep going. Something about the man's absolute stillness felt incredibly wrong. It felt like a trap. Deciding to trust his instinct, the young man pressed his foot onto the gas pedal and drove away, leaving the silent figure behind in the mist. He tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, turning up the volume on his radio and focusing on the white lines painted on the asphalt. But exactly 10 minutes later, his headlights caught another shape on the shoulder of the road. As the car drew closer, the driver's breath caught in his throat, and a cold wave of terror washed over him. Standing on the left shoulder of the road was the exact same man. It was the same tall build, the same dark clothing, and the exact same rigid, frozen posture. The only difference was that he was now on the opposite side of the highway. The young man actually gasped out loud, his voice sounding small and frightened in the quiet cabin of his car. He knew, with absolute certainty, that it was physically impossible for this person to have gotten ahead of him. The driver had been traveling at a steady 35 miles per hour on a single isolated highway with no turnoffs, no cross streets, and no shortcuts. He was the only car on the road, and no one had passed him. For this man to be standing ahead of him again, he would have had to run through the dense, tangled redwood forest at an impossible speed in complete darkness. The driver wanted to look away, to pretend he had not seen him, but as the car approached, he could not help himself. He forced his eyes to look at the figure, and as he did, the man's head suddenly snapped. It was a fast, jerky, unnatural movement. His eyes locked directly onto the driver's eyes. The sheer intensity and malice of that gaze sent a shockwave of adrenaline through the young man's body. He stepped on the gas, accelerating to 45 miles per hour. He knew it was dangerous to drive that fast in the thick fog, but his survival instinct had taken complete control. He needed to get away from this person, or whatever it was, as quickly as possible. But the fog seemed to thicken in response to his panic. The white mist became so dense that the painted lines on the road disappeared entirely. He was driving blind, and the fear of launching his car off a cliff or crashing into a tree forced him to slam on his brakes and slow back down. His mind was in a state of chaos. He was physically exhausted, terrified, and desperately trying to convince himself that he was experiencing a highly vivid, sleep-deprived hallucination. He told himself that his tired brain was projecting his fears onto the fog, creating a phantom that did not actually exist. But his attempts at rationalization were violently shattered just 3 minutes later. His headlights cut through the swirling mist to reveal a figure standing directly in the middle of his lane. The young man slammed his foot onto the brake pedal with all his might. The tires groaned as the car slid to a sudden, jarring halt, stopping just feet away from the person. This time, the figure was wearing a dark hood, pulled low over their face, completely obscuring their features. But the driver knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was the same man. The figure stood perfectly still in the beam of the headlights, showing no fear or reaction to the car that had almost crushed him. The young man sat frozen, his hands trembling violently on the steering wheel. The silence was deafening. He flashed his high beams repeatedly, hoping the blinding light would force the person to move out of the way. But the figure remained motionless, a dark, silent barrier blocking his path. Realizing he was trapped, the driver decided to put his car in reverse and back away. But as he shifted gears and looked up at his rearview mirror, his heart stopped. In the dim red glow of his taillights, he saw another figure emerging from the fog behind him. This person was slowly, deliberately walking toward the rear of his car. He was completely boxed in. He was caught in a coordinated physical trap. The realization hit him with a wave of pure, unadulterated panic. He yelled a curse out loud, threw the car back into drive, and spun the steering wheel hard to the right. He slammed his foot onto the accelerator, swerving his car into the oncoming lane to go around the hooded figure in front of him. As he sped past the hooded man, he braced for an impact, expecting the figure to throw themselves at his car. But the man did not move. Just as the driver pulled back into his lane, believing he had escaped, a massive, violent impact rattled the entire vehicle. It was a heavy, crushing blow to the rear of his car. The force of the impact was so great that the back end of the vehicle jolted violently to the right, nearly causing him to lose control and crash into the trees. He heard a horrific sound of grinding metal and shattering plastic echoing through the night. He fought the steering wheel, desperately maintaining control of the car. His first thought was that another vehicle had materialized out of the fog and rammed him from behind. He checked his mirrors, expecting to see headlights or the wreckage of another car. But the road behind him was completely empty. There was nothing there. No headlights, no wreck, and no sign of the two people who had just cornered him. There was only the thick, silent white fog. He did not slow down. He pushed his car as fast as he could, driving through the blinding mist until he finally reached the major highway interchange that led back toward the safety of the Bay Area. As he drove further south, the fog began to clear, and the familiar sights of the highway returned. He felt his breathing slow down, and the logical part of his brain began to reassert itself. He convinced himself that he had experienced a massive, incredibly detailed waking dream, brought on by extreme exhaustion and highway hypnosis. It was the only explanation that made sense. There was no way those people could have been real. He was relieved, believing he had simply survived a terrifying mental trick. But when he finally parked in his driveway in Oakland and walked around to the back of his car, his relief vanished. The rear bumper of his car was completely destroyed. A massive, deep dent ran across the entire width of the bumper, and the metal underneath was twisted and bent. The physical damage was extensive, and it proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the impact had been real. He had not hallucinated the crash. He stood in the cold morning air, staring at the damage for several minutes. He searched the dent for any signs of paint transfer from another car, but there was none. There was only his own ruined paint. If he had been hit by a car, there would have been a clear transfer of color, but whatever had hit him had left no trace of itself, only a crushing, powerful blow that had nearly run him off the road. He called the police to report the incident, but without any solid evidence or suspect descriptions, there was nothing they could do. For the past 4 years, he has lived with the terrifying knowledge that he was not alone in the fog that night. He had been stalked, trapped, and physically attacked by something that left no paint, no footprints, and no explanation. If you think that highway encounter was an isolated incident of terror, consider what happened to a college senior during his spring break just a few weeks ago. This young man was in his final year of university, preparing for graduation. For his spring break, he decided to return to his suburban hometown. The town was a typical quiet development, safe but incredibly dull. There were no activities, no nightlife, and nowhere for a college student to hang out. To make matters worse, none of his high school friends shared his spring break schedule. He was facing a week of complete isolation and boredom. He had also recently decided to make some positive changes in his life, specifically trying to cut back on alcohol and nicotine. He knew that boredom would make his cravings worse, so he resolved to focus entirely on physical fitness. He planned to lift weights in the morning and go for a long run every afternoon to keep his mind occupied and his body tired. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, he decided a familiar 3-mile loop that he had run hundreds of times during his high school cross-country years. The route started at his front door, went through his neighborhood for about a quarter of a mile, and then entered a dense, quiet trail that wound through a local patch of forest before exiting back onto the street near his home. He loved this trail because it was peaceful and soft on his joints. He headed out around 5 in the afternoon. The sun was not going to set for another 2 hours, so he had plenty of daylight. But as soon as he stepped outside, he was struck by the appearance of a bizarre, incredibly thick fog. It was not a typical light mist. It was a heavy, dense fog that seemed to hang frozen in the air. It looked almost artificial, like a low-resolution filter in a video game. Visibility was reduced to about 30 feet, but since the trail was a single straight path with no forks, he was not worried about getting lost. He started his GPS sports watch and set off at a steady pace. He entered the woods, where the thick trees blocked out the remaining light, casting the path into a dim gray shadow. The fog was even denser under the canopy, but he kept his eyes on the dirt trail and maintained his running rhythm. He checked his watch at the 1-mile mark, and again at the 1.5-mile mark. Everything was normal, but as he reached the point where he should have been completing the loop, around the 2.5-mile mark, he realized he was still deep in the forest. The trail should have curved to the left, leading up a small hill that exited onto the paved streets. But the path ahead of him remained straight and endless. He checked his watch and saw that he had reached 3 miles, which was the entire length of the loop. Yet, he was still surrounded by dense trees, with no sign of the exit. He came to a stop, his heart rate spiking as a sudden sense of confusion and dread washed over him. He knew this trail perfectly. There were no other paths, no branches, and no way to get off track unless he had physically pushed his way through the thick undergrowth, which he had not done. He looked at his watch, which was now reading 1 miles and continuing to tick upward even though he was standing completely still. He assumed the older GPS watch was simply malfunctioning due to the thick fog and tree cover, but his physical surroundings did not lie. He was lost in a forest he had known for a decade. Deciding that retracing his steps was the safest option, he turned around and began to run back in the direction he had come. But the fog had grown even thicker, reducing his visibility to less than 15 feet. He had to slow his pace to avoid tripping over roots or running off the trail. He had been running back for about a mile when he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. The local woods were far too small to support large animals, and they were usually completely silent. But now, a low vibrating sound was echoing through the trees. It was a deep, mechanical drone that sounded like a human moan, but it possessed a bizarre, unnatural rhythm. The sound fluctuated, rising in pitch and then dipping back down, sounding like a distant, wavering siren. It was a cold, purposeful noise that did not sound like a call for help or a cry of pain. It was simply a terrifying, rhythmic drone that seemed to be moving through the forest. A wave of pure terror hit the young man. He began to run as fast as his tired legs would carry him, but he was already exhausted from his long run, and his breath was shallow and rapid. Every time he glanced over his shoulder, he saw nothing but the swirling white fog, but the sound did not fade. No matter how fast he ran, the source of the noise stayed directly behind him, matching his speed and maintaining the exact same distance. He felt like he was trapped in a living nightmare, fleeing from an invisible, relentless stalker through an endless white void. He pushed his body to its absolute limits, his lungs burning and his muscles screaming for relief. Finally, he saw the edge of the trees ahead. He burst out of the forest and collapsed onto the paved suburban street, gasping for air and clutching his chest. He turned around to look back at the trail he had just fled, and there, standing in the middle of the path just beyond the entrance of the woods, was a massive dark shape. It was a towering silhouette, standing at least 7 feet tall. It was a solid black mass that stood completely still in the fog. It did not move toward him, but it did not retreat. The only sign of life was a gentle, slow swaying motion, as if the entity was rocking back and forth on its feet. The strange droning sound had finally stopped, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its place. The young man scrambled to his feet and ran all the way to his house, locking the door behind him and refusing to look out the windows. He has since returned to his college campus, but he has never been able to forget that night. He knows that no human could have run through those dense woods at that speed, while maintaining that terrifying, continuous vocal sound. Whatever was waiting for him in the fog that night, it was something ancient, hostile, and completely unexplained. If you think these forest and highway encounters are terrifying, our third story takes us to the cold, isolated waters of Willapa Bay in Washington State, where 2 experienced outdoorsmen faced an impossible stalker in the mist. This incident occurred about 6 years ago, during the late days of September. The narrator of this story and his close friend Edwin had been planning a kayaking trip to Willapa Bay for over 2 years. They had finally managed to coordinate their schedules and lock in a weekend to make the trip happen. Willapa Bay is a massive, 25-mile-long tidal estuary located on the rugged coast of Washington. It is a beautiful, peaceful area known for its wildlife refuge, salt marshes, and extensive oyster farms. On a clear day, it is a paradise for kayakers. But the weekend they chose was far from clear. Neither of these men were amateurs. They had both been kayaking since they were children, and were highly experienced in water safety and navigation. Edwin had even worked as a professional wilderness guide during his college summers, teaching tourists how to handle rough waters and navigate difficult coastlines. They were equipped with a handheld GPS unit, a compass, and all the necessary safety gear. They were not the kind of people who would get easily frightened or confused by the water. They launched their kayaks early on a Saturday morning from a quiet spot near Nakota. A thick, heavy blanket of coastal fog had settled over the bay, reducing visibility to about 40 feet. They knew the marine layer was common in the mornings, and expected the sun to burn it off by mid-morning. They kept their kayaks close together, checking their compass bearings and enjoying the quiet, muffled atmosphere of the bay. But around 9 in the morning, a strange sound broke the silence. It was a distinct, heavy splashing sound coming from the fog to their right. At first, the narrator assumed it was just Edwin adjusting his stroke or hitting a small wave. But when he looked over, he saw that Edwin's paddle was resting flat across his lap. Edwin was not moving. He looked at the narrator with a tense expression and asked if he had heard the sound too. The narrator nodded, and they both stopped paddling, allowing their kayaks to drift silently. They listened intently, and the sound came again. It was the distinct, rhythmic sound of heavy wooden oars dipping into the water and pulling back. This was not the light, slicing sound of a kayak paddle. It was the unmistakable sound of a traditional rowboat being propelled by oars, and it sounded incredibly close, perhaps only 100 feet away in the thick mist. Edwin tried to remain rational, whispering that it was probably just a local fisherman checking crab pots, or another boater navigating the bay. Sound travels exceptionally well over open water, and the fog could easily distort the distance, making a faraway boat sound like it was right next to them. They waited, expecting the other boater to call out or emerge from the mist. It is standard safety protocol in low visibility to announce your presence to avoid collisions. But there was no shout, no whistle, and no signal. The steady, rhythmic rowing sound simply continued without a pause. Edwin decided to call out, shouting a loud hello into the white void. They waited for a response, but there was only silence, followed by the continuous, steady sound of the oars. The rower did not speed up, slow down, or alter their course. It was as if they had completely ignored the call, or were entirely unaware of their presence. They decided to resume paddling, hoping to put some distance between themselves and the strange boat. But over the next 20 minutes, the heavy rowing sound stayed with them, keeping perfect pace with their kayaks, regardless of how fast they paddled or what direction they took. The relentless, mechanical consistency of the sound began to wear on their nerves, filling the silent fog with an oppressive sense of dread. At one point, they decided to shift their course toward the east, hoping to get closer to the shoreline. As they turned, a sudden gust of wind swept across the water, temporarily thinning the fog. For a brief, terrifying 3 seconds, the narrator saw it. A small, dark wooden rowboat was sitting in the water directly to their right. Inside the boat, he could clearly see the silhouette of a person sitting at the oars, their body hunched over as they rowed. But before he could call out or get a better look, the fog rolled back in, swallowing the boat once again. He asked Edwin if he had seen it, and Edwin, his face pale and tense, confirmed that he had. The presence of the silent, cloaked rower felt like an active, menacing shadow. The way the boat had followed them without making a sound of its own, refusing to answer their calls, was deeply disturbing. The narrator signaled to Edwin that they were heading back to land immediately, and Edwin did not argue. The problem was navigating the dangerous waters of Willapa Bay in the dense fog. The bay is filled with shallow channels, shifting sandbars, and deep mudflats that can trap a kayak as the tide goes out. Getting stuck on a mudflat in the middle of a freezing fog with an unknown person stalking them was a terrifying prospect. They paddled southeast, moving as quickly as they could without exhausting themselves. The rowing sound stayed with us the whole time. I kept glancing to my right, hoping to catch another glimpse through the fog, but I never did. And then, without any warning, the fog started to lift. It did not clear completely, but it thinned enough that we could suddenly see maybe 100 yards in any direction. I immediately looked to my right toward where the rowing sound had been coming from. There was nothing there. It was just open water. I looked behind us, open water there too. I looked in every direction I could. I saw Edwin doing the same thing, but as far as we could tell, the bay was empty. I looked at Edwin and realized however freaked out I was, he was even more scared. I could see it in his eyes. We kept paddling, and even though the rowing sound had stopped and we could actually see now, the situation was a lot scarier. How could that boat have just disappeared like that? The shore came into view about 5 minutes later, and I was relieved. I thought the ordeal was finally over, but no. We paddled straight for land, not even bothering to look for a suitable landing spot. We hit the shallows and I jumped out into knee-deep water. The water was cold as hell, but I barely noticed. I was just glad to be on solid ground again. For a minute or two, neither of us said anything. We just stood there on the beach, catching our breath, looking out to the bay. The fog was still lifting, which was good, but there was still no boats anywhere out there. Edwin had wandered a little ways up the beach while I was securing my kayak. He told me to follow him, so I did. I realized he was looking at something, and I hurried to catch up to him, but the moment I noticed what he was looking at, I was terrified all over again. There were footsteps, wet, barefoot footsteps leading out of the water and up onto the sand. They were fresh, which was painfully obvious because you can see where water was still pooled in the depressions. Whoever made them had not been out of the water for long. But here is the thing. They did not just lead up to the beach and stop. The prince came out of the water, walked a few feet up toward the tree line, and then turned and followed the shoreline to our left, before eventually cutting back toward the trees and disappearing into the woods. I followed the path with my eyes, trying to trace it backward. The prints were coming from somewhere further down the shore. Whoever made them had seemingly walked up along the water's edge, come up onto the beach right where we had landed, and then headed into the forest. Edwin was just a few steps ahead of me. He said he wanted to leave, but I could not stop looking at the footprints. They were leading somewhere, or rather, they were coming from somewhere, and I wanted to know where. I told Edwin I wanted to follow them back, not into the trees, but the other direction. I wanted to see where they originated. He looked at me like I was out of my mind, which honestly maybe I was, but something about this whole situation had been gnawing at me since we first heard those oars, and I was not ready to just paddle away without at least trying to understand what the hell was going on. Edwin did not want to come back with me, but he also did not want to stand there alone. So after about 30 seconds of back and forth, he reluctantly agreed. We started following those footprints down the shoreline. The fog still had not completely lifted, but the visibility was a lot better at that point. We walked for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, keeping the footprints to our left, and then I saw it. Maybe 50 yards down the beach, pulled up onto the sand at an angle, was a small wooden rowboat. The wood was dark, almost black, and the oars were resting inside it. It was the same boat. I was 100% certain of it. The shape, the color, the size. It was the exact same boats he had seen through the fog when we were out on the water. And now it was here on the shore with a trail of wet footprints leading away from it. I started walking toward it instinctively, but Edwin grabbed my arm. He told me we were leaving, and he said he was not asking this time. He said he did not care what was in the boat or who had been rowing it. We were done. Something about the way he said it took me from curious to downright terrified. Whoever had been in that boat had somehow gotten to shore before us, walked all the way down the beach to the exact spot where we had just happened to land, and then still had time to disappear into the trees. We turned around and started heading back toward the kayaks. Edwin was practically sprinting at that point, and seeing him run only freaked me out even more. We got to our kayaks, shoved them back into the water, and paddled out of there as fast as we could. And that was indeed that. I have thought about that morning a lot over the past 6 years. I have gone through every possible explanation I could think of. The best case scenario is that we were just victims of some elaborate prank, but I think that is somewhat far-fetched. Here is what I keep coming back to. We were on the water for over 2 hours. We paddled in multiple directions, changed course several times, and eventually made a beeline for shore when the fog started lifting. Whoever was in that rowboat would have had to get to land before us in a slower vessel, no less. Walk all the way down the shoreline to the exact spot where we ended up landing, and then disappear into the trees, all before we even hit the beach. It sounds so absurd and impossible that I honestly do not know what to think. So that is why after I write this, I am going to try not to think about it ever again. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.